Teresa?
Hi there. Thanks for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. My name is Teresa. Thank you. My name is Teresa Bedurk, and I work with the Extension Office. How many of you, show of hands, know who the Extension Office is here? You guys are right down the street from my office, which is also in the same location as the Florida Botanical Gardens. You all are welcome. Everyone's welcome. We're here to help bring science-based information from the University of Florida, which is our land-grant institution here in Florida. We're just here to bring that information to everybody in the county. So we partner, Pinellas County partners with the University of Florida and USDA, and then we come out and do stuff like this. But I want you guys to know I have cards up at the front table. Oh, and I also have handouts. Johnny? There were handouts, just I think someone was going to help pass them out. Hopefully there's enough for everybody. And I just want you to know I don't normally waste a lot of paper on handouts, but I had some specific plant list information that I thought if you want it, it would be helpful. If you don't need them, you can leave them on the table. I'll use them at another program so they won't go to waste. So anyways, we're here for you guys. I also have some cards that have our contact information. Whether you know it or not, we have a help desk at the Extension Office, and Monday through Friday, from 8 to 5, you can walk in the door with your plant questions, with your insect questions. We aren't beekeepers though, so y'all know more about bees than we do. But if you're talking about, what we're going to talk about today, if you're talking about plants and things that are in your landscape or your garden, we're here to help with that kind of stuff. So that's why I was invited here. And I just want to thank you guys for what you do before I get started. This month has turned out for me to be all about pollinators. And I didn't plan it, and it's popular, so I get requests to talk about pollinators and related issues all the time. But for whatever reason, it was in the air that this November was like Pollinator November for me. And a few days ago, I was at the Palm Harbor Library talking about pollinators in our food supply. So just like that, there was a slide going around earlier where it showed Thanksgiving with pollinators and without pollinators. We actually had that discussion. I have a whole board where people have to guess what they get to keep for Thanksgiving dinner and what they don't get to keep. And so I just thought I wanted to share that with you guys, that it's really important what you do, that the general public is starting to understand the importance of pollinators, and we're trying to help get that word out. But it's just great to see so many of you at a meeting like this doing something that is so impactful to the environment. And obviously, like your president said, will make you lots and lots of friends, right? So the other thing that I do at the Extension Office is I coordinate the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, so if you had any questions about Master Gardeners as well, I'm your gal. So my background really quick is I basically fell in love with plants as a kid, and I tried to study them every which way from Sunday that I could. So I have an undergraduate degree in botany, and then I have a graduate degree in landscape architecture, and then I decided to become an arborist as well. So I keep looking for new ways to study plants, but I haven't fit much else into it, in my life while I'm working. But I love plants. I love everything about them. And so hopefully maybe I can impart some of that wisdom on you guys today. All right, so I was invited here to talk about, perennials for pollinators. And perennials is like a really big topic in the botanical world. You guys familiar with annuals versus perennials? There'll be a lot of heads nodding, just in case you don't want to admit, you don't know which it is, because science class was a long time ago. Perfect. An annual plant lives out its whole life cycle in like one growing season. It may not literally take an entire year. It's one growing season. The whole thing grows and flowers and produces seed and dies, and that's an annual. In Florida, that can happen in a matter of months, or it can take, many months to a year or so. There's also another class of plants that I don't mention called biennial plants. You guys have heard of that? Heads nodding, a few heads nodding. And those take 2 growing cycles or life cycles to live out their lives. So instead of an annual doing it one, usually a biennial plant, like a carrot is a good example that most people are familiar with. It has to go through 2 growing seasons to live out its life. And so that brings us to where we are tonight in the perennial world, which is basically something that lives for more than 2 years, or 2 full life cycles of the plant, and lives on. And a perennial can live for just those 2 or 3 years, or it can live for hundreds of years, like oak trees and some of the larger perennials. So when I was asked to talk about perennials for pollinators, I thought, how exactly will I narrow that down? A lot of garden centers will call perennials your not quite a shrub, not quite a wildflower plant. So we're kind of focused mainly on the longer lived than your wildflowers to not quite a shrub. But I do mention some shrubs because I think it's really important that we have these really long-lived things for two reasons. Number one, maintenance is an issue in the landscape, and y'all are busy with your bees, so you don't need to be doing yard work, right? And the other one is cost. So if you have to keep buying new plants all the time, it's expensive. And so we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things. Perennials can also be woody or herbaceous. So in the pictures you see up here, the one on the right, the Chickasaw plum, is a perennial that's very woody. It gets secondary woody growth, like our trees do. And small shrubs can do that, even something like beach sunflower, if you guys are familiar with that. It's a very low-growing, mostly herbaceous perennial, but it can actually get woody over time. Or the more herbaceous perennials that are always green and soft and they don't grow that hard secondary kind of wood. So that's just kind of an overview because the botanist in me can't resist. Okay, so how did I come to some of the choices that I brought you? There are many resources. The last part of your handout mentions a lot of the places I get the information from. But I focused on a few things in particular. Obviously, things that are good for pollinators, right? But as you guys know, pollinators are lots of things. Bees, butterflies, moths, bats even. I mean, any number of insects are pollinators. I myself have been a pollinator. If you've ever grown a vegetable garden, sometimes you need to intervene a little bit. So we can all be pollinators. So I picked stuff, we're going to talk about those things that are obviously good for pollinators. I also tried to pick stuff that I thought you would have a relatively easy time finding. Because there's a lot of really cool native plants out there that are great for our pollinators. But if I told you a whole bunch of them and you all ran over to the local native nursery and tried to find them all, some may or may not be as available. So I tried to pick ones I thought you could find. And I also tried to find some of the plants that were a little bit more low maintenance and easier to take care of. I didn't want to send you home with a list of really persnickety plants that were going to die on you if you didn't pay attention to them. Okay, so just to give you a quick overview of where I got some of the information, it's in the references. The University of Florida has a really cool fact sheet. You all probably know it. When I show other people, they don't always know it. Florida honeybee plants. So that's one. I sort of cross-referenced several things. And actually, when Jennifer came to speak to my master gardeners, it was like a week ago, which she was fantastic, by the way. They loved her. She brought plants for native bees in Florida that was from Bee College up at the university, Dr. Rachel Mounger, so I kind of lined those up. And then I did something else. Are you guys familiar with the Florida Native Plant Society? Show of hands. Some of you might be members. They have an online tool, and this is on the last page of your handout. It's like a plant selector tool. And you can pick things like, I have a sunny location, and I would love it to be great for wildlife, and I want showy flowers. And that's kind of what I told it to narrow in on what pollinators might be interested in. And it'll spit out a list specific to you. You put your county and all that information in, it spits out a list of plants, organized trees, shrubs, etc. And so I sort of crossed all those and came up with the ones we'll highlight today. They're not the only ones that you guys will find fantastic, but I tried to at least get us narrowed in a little bit. All right, so some quick notes on how to take care of these plants, because as a horticulture agent, I'm always telling people how to not kill their plants. Number one, for you guys especially, because you're trying to support your pollinators, is to purchase untreated plants. I bet this room is probably more aware than most people that I talk to, right? That at the garden center, your plants might have been treated with an insecticide or a pesticide before you purchased it. And they usually say that on the label. They've been treated with like a neonicotinoid or something to prevent pest problems. Most of you guys probably know that, so you know not to buy those plants, but if you didn't, be on the lookout for that stuff. So make sure that when you're at the nursery, you're picking plants that have not been treated with something. In terms of finding the plant for you, you want to make sure that you look at how big the plant is going to get. Does it spread? Does it sprawl? Does it get tall? Does it get wide? You really want to pick something that suits you. So if you want something that's only going to grow 2 or 3 feet tall so it stays underneath the windowsill, but you see all this really cool plant in the nursery that said it's going to get 6 to 8 feet tall, you're going to make yourself a lot of work by planting that plant under the window and quite likely kill the plant because you'll have to keep chopping away at it. So really, really pay attention to the mature sizes of the plants, what they say it will be, because you're gonna bring home this cute little pot that looks sweet and innocent, right? And then you're gonna plant it probably too close to the house or too close to another plant, and then you forgot how it gets to be 12 feet wide. So keep all those things in mind. The perfect plant isn't perfect if you don't have room for it. The other thing that you also want to do when you're planting for pollinators, and I always feel like I might be speaking to the choir here, but is plant them in masses. You guys know how hard the bees work and all the pollinators. They're flying back and forth or crawling up and down, and they're working really hard at collecting their nectar and collecting their pollen. And so if you had planted something for them over here in one corner of the yard, and then you plant, oh look, I want to put a new pollinator plant over here on the far other corner of the yard, that's a lot of space for these little insects to move. So if you plant things together, group them in masses of color and similar plants so that they don't have to go quite so far. And on a side note, as a landscape architect, it usually looks better when you do that. So your neighbors will appreciate it, and you won't have to give them so much of that hush honey he was talking about. Because they'll be like, what a beautiful garden this is. So that's really important. The other thing, of course, is having year-round blooms, and I'm sure you guys are becoming acutely aware of this now that it's getting a little bit cooler. There are less things flowering than there were a few months ago. Soon there'll be even fewer things flowering. So it's really important as you're adding new plants to your landscape that you make sure that you think about providing flowers year-round. I don't know about y'all's neighborhoods. I don't know where everybody lives, but I drive through some neighborhoods and I see some yards that have no flowers. And it's not like, oh, that's not a great pollinator plant, or oh, that's an invasive exotic, whatever. It's like, no, there's nothing flowering. There's some colorful leaves, but there's nothing. So look around in the landscape and really be hard on yourself and look around, because you guys are looking for flowers. So think about that very carefully. Something else, again, that you guys probably know, but I think is worth mentioning, is that bees and many pollinators, but not all, prefer yellow, white, blue, and purple colors. So those are some to sort of keep at the top of mind when picking flowers for your garden, to add to your garden. Of course, if you're attracting other than bees, whether they're native or honeybees, all of the colors. I mean, diversity is probably the most important thing. So if the only thing you remember that I talked about today is diversity, just pick lots of different colors. That would be really, really important. Okay, so you got an idea of what plants you're going to get, and you've matched their mature size to the spot you have. If you're going to plant like one plant, this top step about soil testing is probably not super important. But if you're talking about planting a whole new garden, if you're talking about planting an entirely new landscape or the whole front yard or something like that, we're going to spend a lot of money and you're going to spend a lot of time digging and use a lot of our water to establish them. It's probably a really good idea to get a soil test first. Soil pH is the one you really need to test for. The pH of your soil is going to affect how the plants take up nutrients. And so if soil pH is wrong, you're in trouble. And your plants are never going to really thrive. They're not going to flower a lot. And what's the point of that? You were trying to support your bees. So if you're going to do that, if anybody wants to see me after, I didn't bring one for everybody because I know not everyone's going to do it. But we do have a soil testing service that you mail it to Gainesville. I have the test sheets here if you want to come up and see me after and take one home with you. But that's really important because once you know your soil pH, then you can choose the plants that are suited to that. A lot of people try to change the soil pH, and that's not that practical here. In coastal Florida, most of us have very high pHs, very alkaline pHs, which are especially challenging for our garden plants because they like it a little acidic. So you really want to kind of aim for that. But luckily, our native plants, especially the coastal ones, are adapted to our soil. So if you had a really high alkaline soil and you knew it, you could pick the right plants and it would be no big deal. But those are some mistakes I see people do all the time. Something else that we want to make sure of is if you're going to plant some plants, let's start here. What is in your yard right now? What kind of soil do you have in your yard? You just have sand, right? Most of us just have sand. You might have a little organic matter. Maybe you've added compost over the years, or you've got an oak tree. Excuse me. But most of us have sand, and sand does not hold a lot of water or nutrients for plants, and so it's not all that good at supporting our plants. So if you're going to plant, again, if it's one thing you're planting, this is not that important, but if you're planting a whole new section, a whole new garden, that it's a really good idea to amend that soil by adding some compost. So add some organic matter to the soil. They've tested this out. It doesn't do any good to throw a little bit of compost in that one hole of that one plant. It just doesn't really help. It's just wasting your time and money. But if you're digging out a whole planter bed and you can incorporate a little bit of compost before you plant, then they found that that is worthwhile, worth your time, worth the extra money or effort if you make your own compost. The other thing you're going to want to do is what's happening in that top picture there. It's kind of hard to tell, but they're actually shaving the root ball of that plant. Yeah, they did a lot of research on this, so you probably remember, you were taught, you pull the plant out of a little plastic pot and you tease the roots. You stick your fingers in there and rip it all apart a little in case it's root bound. That's bad for a whole, we don't have time to get into that. But they actually found that if you shave off that root ball, it's even better for plant establishment. So you don't want to like tear into it and rip all the roots off. You just want to cut with a sharp shovel. You want to cut the outside edge, because what happens is those roots hit the edge of the pot and they don't stop. They just turn and go in a circle. And it turns out that teasing them doesn't help because they've got a memory of that curve. So when you tease them out, that looks great when you first plant it, they just keep curving around and around and they eventually just get really, really root bound in the hole you put them in. So this is why they recommend shaving the root ball. Obviously the bigger the plant's going to be, the more important that is, but it matters. And when you plant your plant, this is another big problem, or big mistake that people make. Make sure that 10% of that root ball, just like in the picture on the bottom, so there's our root ball that used to be in a pot, we shaved it. We dug a hole, we want the hole to be wider than the pot, but we don't want it to be deeper. We actually want it to be kind of shallow, so there's the existing grade. We want the top of that root ball to stick up about 10%. And then, when we fill it back in with the soil, we bring the mulch up to the root ball, but not on top of it, because you can actually smother those roots and keep water from getting to those roots. So those are really important. If you bury the plant root ball underneath the soil, if you've ever had a plant where you did this and it never really grew much and it stayed kind of small, almost like it was bonsai, that's probably why. So it's important not to cover up the root ball of your plants. Also, if you're going to do, technical tip, if you're going to do a big garden area, call 811 or go on the website 811 for digging in Florida, and they will come and mark for free all the utilities on your site so that you won't accidentally hit a gas line when you're putting in your lovely pollinator garden. The only thing they won't mark is your own private irrigation lines, so just be careful because you'll probably break those. We usually do. Water is super important. I don't have to tell you guys. We don't have enough water here. Maybe I do have to tell you. I don't know. I talk to a lot of people about water all the time, and it seems like a lot of people go, oh, what do you mean we don't have water? We're surrounded by water, right? Well, I don't know if you've ever tried to drink the water in the Gulf or water your vegetable garden with it. Doesn't work really well. We don't have a lot of water that we can use for drinking, for bathing, for watering our plants. And, you know, there's a lot of projections out there about development in Florida and water use. But at this point, one of the solid projections that we look at is pointing at by 2030, which is now how many years away? 10. By 2030, we might not have enough water in Florida to irrigate outside anymore at all. If you still want to bathe and stuff anyways. You know, like if you're willing to sacrifice doing the dishes and taking a shower, then you could probably water. But I would prefer to keep that stuff. So we really want to plan for this second tip here. For no irrigation after the initial establishment period. I want everyone to go home and go, what can I plant that isn't going to require me irrigating it once I establish it? That I can walk away and in all but maybe the most extreme drought scenario, I don't need to water that plant. And it's possible if you pick the right plants. You're going to group your plants according to water needs too, so that if you do decide that there are a handful of plants that you like that require some more water, put them together so you can efficiently water them in one spot and not have to water the entire landscape just to get 2 or 3 plants the extra water they need. And the other tip is, it seems super easy to those of us who have been in Florida for a long time, but plant at the start of the rainy season. So right around, well, it varies a little bit every year, but July-ish. Starts to rain almost every day, pretty regularly. If I plant right before that, then I don't have to do this watering every 2 to 4 days that I need to do for a brand new plant. And so that saves me a lot of time and money and that water supply. Okay, so plant your plant. A small pot, like a 3-gallon pot, on average, you need to put about a gallon of water down for each of those plants every 2 to 4 days. There's a range there because if you do it every 2 days, it's going to establish faster and thrive more quickly. But if you're doing it during the rainy season, you're going to get plenty of water. So that's my best recommendation. Take your time now in the winter to plan, and then in the summertime, get your plants in the ground. All right. So I'm talking about diversity a lot. I talk about diversity a lot in every talk. Have you guys ever heard the term eat the rainbow? Our nutrition folks, they're right next door to my office, so I hear this stuff all the time. It's important for us to eat the rainbow. It's important, like Johnny said, we should not eat cheeseburgers all the time. You know, that's not the only thing we can live on. So just like that, and I was glad that he said that, you know, it's important for our bees and our other pollinators to have a diversity in their food supply as well. Consequently, because I love plants and I'm selfish about plants, they also need a diversity of insects and animals to thrive, because they like being pollinated and they like spreading their DNA far and wide, since they don't move around, but the bees do. And so that's why diversity matters, and why if you don't remember anything I said, but you remember next time you're at the nursery and pick a diversity of plants, then I've done something for you. We also want to avoid modern hybrids. They do some crazy stuff in the plant world. And they create some really beautiful flowers. I mean, there's no doubt that these things are quite delightful for us to look at. As you can see in the picture on the left, that's a hibiscus. It's a single, or traditional hibiscus would be. Our pollinators and bees have no trouble figuring out where they're supposed to go and how to get to the nectar and to the pollen of a plant like this. On the right, oops, wrong one. On the right is Confederate rose, which is a type of hibiscus, and this one in particular is a double fancy-dancy little hybrid. I forget its name exactly, but can you imagine if you're a pollinator and you were like, well, wait, do I go in here? Do I go in here? That's a lot of wasted energy. So if you really love these things, you want to throw one in to be fancy, that's fine, but we really should keep these things to a minimum in the landscape for the pollinators. You throw in a couple for yourself, it's like getting that cheeseburger now and then. Yeah, right? A lot of food analogies. I'm hungry. All right. We also want to avoid the sterile varieties of invasive exotic plants. So you guys have probably heard about invasive exotics. Show of hands, nod your head. We know there's a lot of plants that don't belong here in Florida, and they're kind of bullies and they push the other plants out. But a lot of nifty plant breeders, for a whole bunch of reasons we won't get into, like to breed sterile varieties of these things. People love them, they do attract pollinators, they sell well in the nursery and whatever. So they go to a lot of trouble to come up with these varieties that are sterile. They don't set viable seeds. Some of them don't even have viable pollen, or they produce less pollen. Does that sound like a good idea for y'all's pollinators? Not really. So they're just kind of a waste garden space. And you guys are talking about making sure your bees survive the winter. You don't have the space to waste on that. Most of us don't have a big yard, so don't do it. The other reason I don't like the sterile varieties of invasive plants is I feel like we're being bad examples. A good one is the Mexican petunia. You guys know the tall purple flower. It's been a pollinator, butterfly garden favorite for years. It's an invasive exotic that we don't recommend. But there is a sterile variety. So people always like, well, why can't I just plant the sterile variety, Teresa? It's not going to invade. But then what happens if your neighbor sees that you have that Mexican petunia, and they go, oh, that's a great plant, and they see all the pollinators. They're like, oh, well, the beekeeper has that plant. That's a good plant. And then what do? They either go buy the regular one, or they dig it up from their neighbor's yard, and they share it and stuff. So you don't want to be the bad example. So that's why that's on the no-no list. Okay. The other thing that we need to push for is our native plants. Native plants are great for all kinds of reasons that y'all don't have time for tonight. But the short, quick, dirty reason why native plants are great is they're adapted to Florida. Now, how many of you guys are from Florida? Raise your hand. Born here. Born in Florida. Okay. So you all know what it's like here. You see the new people. They never have any idea what it's going to be like here. They're shocked. They don't know when to plant anything. They're hot all the time. It's funny. But the native plants, they know what to do here. They know which insects. The insects have co-evolved with them. They might have special pollinators, they all work together. They know they can also handle the awful soil we have here, AKA sand. So they do an easier job for you in the landscapes. You're gonna have less work the more natives that you plant. And also, they've also done some studies that we were talking about, Jennifer talked about, and I was at the Master Gardener Conference recently, and some folks from the university talked about, they've been doing some studies to see, do pollinators really care if the plants are native, or do they just care that there's nectar and pollen at the end? And there are many insects that actually prefer native plants. So they found there is a reason, there is a preference for native plants, especially obviously among the native pollinators. So it is important even for pollinators. It's not just that you can be a lazier gardener, which is also a really good reason. This is a screenshot and a link to the Florida Native Plant Society plant selector tool where you get to pick, here's my county, here's the kind of site I have if it's sunny or whatever, and that's how you can drill down into a specific list for you. As if I haven't said it, no invasive exotics, all right? Invasive exotic plants and animals cost the state of Florida hundreds of millions of dollars per year. That's your money, that's my money. That's not like magic government money. That's the money that we gave them to do stuff. And so every opportunity that we have in our own landscapes to remove an invasive plant is literally putting money back into our pockets. They push out native plants, crowd them out, and in many cases turn them into environments where like that invasive exotic plant is the only plant that can live there. Some of them actually use like guerrilla warfare and release chemicals into the soil so that other plants can't even grow there. Yeah, it's fascinating from a botany perspective, but it's terrible for the ecology. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you realize in your landscape that you have an invasive exotic plant, remove it if you can. So if you have like a Brazilian pepper seedling or a carrotwood seedling, that's easy to remove, right? It's little, I can dig it up. If you have a 40-foot tall camphor tree in your backyard that has a 3 or 4 foot circumference trunk, it might cost you many thousands of dollars to hire an arborist to remove it. I get it, you can't do everything, but whatever you can, remove the ones that you can actually deal with. So if you're curious about finding out more about native plants, make a little note. IFAS, I-F-A-S, that's us, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. IFAS assessment. You could go on that site, put in the name of a plant, and they actually have nice color pictures, and they'll tell you if it's invasive, if it belongs here, if it's Florida friendly, which means it's not from here, but it doesn't do any bad things. And it also will tell you if it looks like it's going to become invasive. And so you can like kind of keep an eye on those plants and make sure they behave themselves. All right, so now we're going to get into a few slides about specific plants, and I'm not going to like read the slides at you guys. That's what I made the handouts for. But I thought that was a good picture. I don't know who took that picture. I stole it. Of massing plants, though, so that you could see what those masses look like. I actually should have taken one outside, but it was really, really bright every time I tried to go outside this week. Not that I'm complaining about the lovely weather. I separated this first section into winter, spring, summer, and fall. So, because we talk about having year-round flowers, and a lot of people seem to find that like challenging, like, oh, I don't have a garden degree, I'm not a landscape architect, I don't know what flowers when. So this is a short selection of the many plants that might suit you that bloom during this time of year. Now some of them bloom, you'll see in some other notes I have in there, they may bloom from spring all the way through fall. And I just decided to pick which one I thought was when it was most impactfully blooming. This very first plant, I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with, the Spanish needles plant that you see to the right here. It's got a little honeybee on it. Who loves this plant? Hey, okay, I love you guys. Because when I go to other groups and I ask them that, they're all like, I hate that plant, that's a weed. And I'm like, okay, it's a weed, it's a native wildflower. What do you mean weed? That's not a weed. It's right. A weed is just a plant like whose good properties you haven't yet discovered, but it will get everywhere. But it is also one of the few things that really attracts a huge list of pollinators when it's flowering. It's one of the few things that during the colder months, especially like in January and February, is still reliably flowering. And so it's really good, even if you hate the way that it behaves and you feel like it's a weed, to maybe relegate it some space in the garden. Give it a spot, out of the way. I have a fluffy dog. The seeds get all stuck in his fur, so I have to be careful about where I allow it to grow. But this is like the old faithful pollinator plants, so make sure you're not looking down on it too hard. I was actually walking around the gardens today just trying to warm up, and I was doing a dorky botany thing under a sand pine, and it was really in a shady spot, and I looked over in full shade, way away from a nice warm sunny spot, was a honeybee on that plant, and a little scraggly little flower in the shade where it was cold, and it didn't seem like it would be happy there, but it was happy there. So I give that a spot, especially every January, February, before a lot of other stuff starts flowering. I give it a spot or two in my yard, and I let it go crazy, and I remove it elsewhere, and it's a fabulous pollinator plant. Some of the other ones that you see up here that are blooming and still in the winter, Coreopsis, which is our state wildflower. Goldenrod is a great one. Blueberries are really good pollinator plants as well. But let me tell you, if you're going to grow blueberries, who's ever tried to grow blueberries in Florida? How did it go? Yeah. That's what everyone says.
The rabbits liked it.
What's that?
The rabbits like them.
Well, I'm sure the rabbits like them. The biggest problem folks have with blueberries is they like a really acidic soil, like 5.5, which is a very acidic soil. And our soils here in Pinellas generally, because I see everyone's soil tests, are like maybe 6.8 to like 8.5. So you can't plant them in the ground, they need to be in a container, but they do really well if you provide them an acidic soil to grow in. Makes a great pollinator plant, and of course blueberries are delicious. Sweet acacia is a nice kind of a shrub. It could be a small tree. If you don't like your neighbors, you would plant that like on the property line. You see those spines there, those horrible thorns? They're rather painful, so do not put this near the walkway that you want to walk by. But these are excellent at attracting pollinators, and they smell really, really good. All right, spring blooms, we get into springtime, and everything's blooming in the springtime, right? So it's almost like a no-brainer time. You plant some native flowering things, you're good to go. Some of the things that I see a lot of pollinators on, and fell on a bunch of these lists, you can see listed here. A few of my favorites, beautyberry I love because pollinators are all over when it flowers, and the birds eat the fruit. It makes these beautiful purple fruits. There's also a white one. But it's just a fantastic addition to the garden and attracts a lot of wildlife. The other one that is, I feel like, getting more popular now is the wild coffee, Psychotria nervosa. That's the plant that you see up in the upper left-hand corner. Beautiful shiny leaves, nice little white flowers that are, every pollinator in town is all over. And then a lovely wine-colored fruit that the birds like later in the year. Saw palmetto, from what I hear from other beekeepers, makes delicious honey, right? And that's a palm that generally starts flowering relatively early in the springtime. Palms in general are good for pollinators, but that one gets started a little bit before the others, so that gives you that spread throughout the year. All right, summer blooms, some of these keep going. Obviously, some of the same things keep going. I added in a really cool plant. I was talking to one of my colleagues about this presentation, and he goes, "Do you have sable minor on that list?" And I said, "No, I don't have sable minor. I should have that." So that's the one that says dwarf palmetto, sable minor. It's a relative of our sable palm, which is our state tree, which is not a tree. We can talk about that later. That's fun. But sable minor will get to be about yay big. And it looks like just the top of a cabbage palm tree. It's what you see in that upper right-hand corner. That one's not quite fully grown. But it looks like the top of it, like somebody buried the whole trunk and all you had was the top of the palm. And that's all the bigger it gets. It doesn't get a big old trunk. This is it. This is what all you get. And then it brings up the big flower stalks actually stick outside the palm canopy. Really, really pretty. Attracts pollinators just like the cabbage palm and the saw palmetto do. But it's a nice low maintenance, doesn't get too big, looks tropical even in our crummy sandy soils. And I was really glad that he pointed that out because it was not all that easy to find in the past, but it's becoming more and more popular, and so you can usually find it at native nurseries now. And I'm so glad that he mentioned that. I feel like that's important. Another one that people consider a weed, this one right here, spiderwort, also known as dayflower, is a really good pollinator plant. For many of us, it comes up as a weed. I like to call them volunteers in my yard. Sometimes when things come up where they don't belong, I might move them to a more appropriate place. But that's a really great pollinator plant. There are many of them. They're not all native, but the one listed there, Tradescanthia ohioensis, is, if you're concerned about that, which I know I am. So that's another good one. Tried to pick out different colored flowers for you as well. The other one that's on this, I'm having, I don't know, a moment here trying to figure out which one to point at. Where did it go? Wild petunia, Ruellia carolinensis. That's the one here in the bottom right corner. Remember I mentioned Mexican petunia, the invasive naughty plant? This is its native, not naughty cousin. And it's not as purpley. It's a much more subtle purple. It doesn't grow as tall and showy and like bodacious, but it grows kind of low and it'll pop up all over in a garden, and it doesn't mind a little bit of shade here and there, and attracts just as many pollinators. So that's a great swap if you really wanted to have the petunia, but you don't want the invasive one. All right, and then we move into the fall, and as I'm sure most of you guys know, fall is wildflower season in Florida. All kinds of wonderful wildflowers are blooming in the fall. It's almost like too easy at that point in time for the pollinators. But I suppose that's good because they're getting ready to go into the cold time of the year, and so they probably need that extra energy to get them through the winter. A couple of like fall stars are the spotted mint, aka bee balm, which I'm sure many of you have, covered in pollinators of all kinds if you grow that. Doesn't mind sandy, crummy soil, so you will plant it, and you won't have to do anything to it, and you almost won't have too much of it. So just be warned, so you have to really like it because it will go everywhere. But it's an easy plant for your pollinators. The other one that I put on here, this screen over here, be careful, is marlberry. This one's a shrub, so we branched to a little bit bigger. But marlberry is a great shrub for pollinators. The flowers smell fantastic. It can tolerate like every kind of soil in this area, and the birds like it too. So it's just a really good, solid shrub to have in your landscape. All right, we're running out of time, but we're doing good. Excuse me. All right. Then there's the year-round or nearly so, because some of them, depending on exactly where you live, might kind of not do a lot during the winter, but maybe sporadically flower a little bit. And I feel like this is a good time to mention something. Do y'all know what hardiness zone you're in for growing plants? So at this moment, where I'm standing, we're actually in 10A. And if you are like Safety Harbor, Palm Harbor, Tarpon Springs, you're 9B. And that changed in 2012. And that is one of the many like little hints we get about climate change, that we used to be all 9A and 9B here in Pinellas County. And things are warmer, just like we've all been hearing. So they moved that in 2012. And so everything down here, if you live around this actual location, you're actually in 10A. And so that's important to note, because that tells you what kind of plants you can choose from when you're looking through these plant guides that I hint you should go look at. So in that category, 10A, it's really considered more of a South Florida zone. So the way the university is split up Florida, they just put these big horizontal lines, and they said there's North Florida, there's Central Florida, and there's South Florida. And we're weird because we're the peninsula on the peninsula, right? We're surrounded by water. We're warmer than the other people nearby and inland. And so it's important that when you're looking at university guidelines, they're going to tell you that we're in Central Florida here, just because they've made these broad strokes. But you guys here are really in 10A, so you really got to kind of lean into the South Florida stuff. That's important. So some of the stuff that might not flower and grow, you know, even up in Gainesville or even up in Brooksville or something like that, probably will here many times. So just keep that in mind. So these are a few of the things that are going to bloom nearly year-round. Beach sunflower, very easy to grow. Again, it will spread and take over. So this is a good, easy, cheap plant if you need to fill a bunch of space. Lots of pollinators. This one will probably volunteer at times if you let a little wildflower grow up once in a while and just see what it turns into. You might have them just volunteer on your property. Scorpion's tail, which is flowering, very pretty now, covered in pollinators, will go throughout the year. So all of these are really good options. That last one, porterweed, is a great pollinator plant, but you have to be careful because there's an invasive porter weed that gets real tall, like as tall as me if you let it. You know you have the native if it stays kind of low and sort of sprawls along the ground. It makes like almost a good ground cover. You wouldn't want to like walk through it though, you might trip over it. But so if you have the really, really tall one, go get you some of the native short ones and swap them out. All right, trees, I won't belabor the point, you have this was outside the scope of our talk, but I put them in there because there's a lot of really good trees out there that could be solid basis for your pollinator garden. And ground covers, I did want to mention ground covers because people ask me about ground covers all the time. People want to mow less, right? I want to mow less, you guys want to mow less. You have bees to take care of, you don't want to mow. So a couple of options that we have here that are great for pollinators and are all native are the sunshine mimosa, which is the one you see the little pink puff balls here. You guys know how much the bees love those things.
Oh, they love it.
They love those things. One that's just fun to say, you can't see a lot of detail here, but it's turkey tangle fog fruit, or people call it matchweed, which I don't like because the word weed in the title.
Say that first thing again.
Turkey tangle fog fruit.
I just wanted to make you say it.
Okay, cool. I actually love to say it. And some people call it frog fruit. It's the same thing if you hear someone say that. That's the trouble with common names of plants. So that's a great, really low ground cover, little white and purpley flower. Lots and lots. I see a lot more, I would say butterflies are attracted to this, probably more than bees, but lots of pollinators on it. And two morning glories, the beach morning glory and the railroad vine. They're more of a sprawling, they're not going to make a thick, lush ground cover, but they make a great one, especially if you're in a coastal location. It looks very beachy, and pollinators love pretty much everything in the morning glory family, so those are some other good options as well. And the other thing you guys probably know, but I always tell people, is sunny spots are great for pollinators. Bare sand. Leave some bare sand. You don't have to fill every little space in your garden with a plant or the mulch. We've been teaching Florida Friendly to people so long and say mulch your ground so that you conserve the water and all, and that's great, but you do need to leave some bare soil. Lots of our native pollinators and other insects need bare soil to actually nest in. And butterflies and bees also use it to puddle, so they use it to collect water. So you could either set up an elaborate thing for them to water from, where they won't drown, or you can leave some bare soil and let Mother Nature wet it from time to time. So that's another way to have less work, less mowing. And these next two slides I'm certainly not going to read, but what I did in these, I want to tell you what I did, and they're like take-home stuff for your handouts. Because people always ask me this stuff. Whatever, insert a number. What 10 plants should I plant in my yard? What are the good ones, right? Geez, I don't know what your yard looks like. I don't know how to answer that question. But in this area, we kind of have two very broad categories of spaces. We either have such dry, sandy soil that it's always just bone dry. Like it could rain 2 feet of rain in a day, and you wouldn't have a puddle in your yard. We got that, and then we have the other ones that during the dry season are bone dry and sandy, but during the rainy season, your yard is a swamp. Yep, those are kind of the two. And then your sun and shade varies depending on your trees. So I only picked sunny stuff, because that's really what we're gonna get the flowers and the pollinators are gonna like the most. But I picked the two sites, the dry sites, and then the dry to wet sites, because we're always gonna have a dry period. The ones on the dry to wet sites are the plants that can tolerate the wild swing from totally dry to very, very wet, and they can survive in those. So what I did in each of these pages, it starts at the top from a ground cover, small plant, and works its way up to a big plant, all the way down. I made sure, if you look in the notes here, that I noted the color of the blooms, and I made sure there's white, yellow, blue, and purple in there to get a good pollinator mix. And then I also noted the time of the year that they bloom, and I made sure there was stuff year-round in all different colors that are for pollinators. So this is the closest I've ever come to and I think it's 9 plants, not 10. What plants could I blend together? And I thought they would look really pretty together too, that you guys could take home and throw into a planter bed and be good for your pollinators. So that's why I printed those things out for you. It's a good thing because we're running out of time. And that is pretty much all that I had. I did want to show you one other thing. Oop, hang on. Oh, no, here, okay. The last page, the resource page. The other thing that I didn't mention, book that I use is up here. It's called Florida's Best Native Landscape Plants. This is a great book. I like it because it talks about all of the requirements of like sun and shade, but it also has notes on wildlife, butterflies, pollinators. It will also tell you if a plant, companion plants that would, like if you find them in nature, what other plants does it live with. So it's like a cheat sheet. So if you find a plant you really, really like and you're not sure what to plant next to it, it shows you a list of companion plants and they are suited to the same type of environment. So it's just a nice, easy book to look through. It also has really, really lovely pictures, flowers, fruit, leaves, line drawings. So it gives you a lot of detailed information. It is slightly less than user-friendly to the non-botanists at first because it lists them alphabetically by their scientific name. So if you are like Latinophobic, I'm sure there's an actual Latin word for that, then you will be a little intimidated at first, but don't be, because there's plenty of like Google sites where you can go, what's that Latin word? Or you can look at my list, and then you can go and look at it. And then lastly, I invite you guys to come and see me. So I have some cards up here if you want to, that have all my contact information. Right down the road in the Botanical Gardens, we're there every single day. Come and see us, come and stay for the holiday lights in the gardens that start just after Thanksgiving. But I'm really here to answer your questions and to help you guys, in your gardens, help you guys supply food for your pollinators. And with that, are there any other questions? Because I move fast, yes?
You mentioned the double flowers.
Yes.
I've been pursuing the double trumpets and double iris. You're saying stay away from them?
Well, if you're focusing garden space for your pollinators, the double flowers tend to be more difficult for them to nectar from. And so I would. Now, like I mentioned, if you have plenty of room, it's kind of like if you're eating a balanced diet, it's okay to have that cheeseburger he mentioned once in a while. So if you have a balanced garden with plenty of opportunities for pollinators, it's not going to hurt to have a couple of those in there. But I just worry that most of us don't have that much space. This is a very urbanized county. You're lucky maybe to have, what, 1/4 of an acre, 1/8 of an acre. So that's why I mentioned that. Are they bad? They're not bad. They're just less good. Does that make sense? Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
Some plants, like driveway insects, was there any plants that would drive away ants from your yard?
Okay, so in case you didn't hear the question, you said some plants drive away insects. Are there any that would keep the ants out of your yard? I wish that there were. And yes, I know some plants do tend to sort of repel insects, but none of them actually in any of the studies are truly effective. So there isn't a plant that you can plant in your yard and it's going to keep the mosquitoes away or the ants away. None of them work in that capacity that anyone's discovered yet. Most of them contain compounds that if you were able to isolate them and apply them in a different way, would work. But the answer, I'm sorry to say, is no. Other questions? Okay, I think I'm turning it over to raffle. Thank you. Appreciate it.